A damning parliamentary inquiry claims the UK government gravely mishandled its initial response to the Covid pandemic, saying thousands of deaths could have been prevented. Senior officials repeatedly avoided every opportunity to apologise, despite the anger of those who lost loved ones.
Our government is a disgrace. They didn't listen, and also they didn't think about the lives. They thought about the money, they thought about the business contracts, and they didn't close the borders, simply just letting our people die. 138,000 people today are gone.
It's called Coronavirus Lessons Learned to Date, and it finds at number 10 delaying the lockdown back in March of the 23rd in 2020 was one of the most important public failures in the history of the United Kingdom. Worse still, the government's handling of the pandemic actually led to 20,000 unnecessary deaths. But a cabinet minister, unfortunately, was unable to refuse or even try and apologise for those claims.
Keen to start with an apology, though, I would have thought.
Well, no, we followed the scientific advice. We protected.
So no apology.
We followed the scientific advice. We protected the NHS. We took the decisions based on the evidence before us. But of course, we've always said, with something so unprecedented as the pandemic, there will be lessons to learn.
So it's not a very gracious look there from Stephen Barclay, a Cabinet Office Minister, who actually in that very interview refused to apologise some 11 times. But looking deeper into this reporting question, it's quite hefty. It's 150 pages long, and almost a year ago to date was when it was first established and when this inquiry really began. Now, they looked at many key areas, including the preparedness for a pandemic, social distancing, social care and the impact on certain communities, plus, of course, the vaccines as well. Well, it's an incredibly traumatic and triggering day for many. For instance, my best friend who lost her mother during the pandemic to COVID, and she's incredibly furious at the government for its handling of the pandemic. But she's certainly not alone. There's thousands of bereaved families up and down the country who are finding this report a very difficult read indeed.
So I lost my grandfather to it, and his best friend of 80 years went the next day. So my family have had our fair share of tragedy from it, but this isn't a personal vendetta of, you know, some kind of emotional trauma. However the government want to go around, treating pandemics in the future, I think this is a big society wake up. We've got to stop letting these born to rule, straight out of private school people run things they don't understand. Why is it that we allow a prime minister with absolutely no common sense to run a serious pandemic? Absolutely everything is down to them. And when you look at the very beginning of this pandemic as well, our government were talking about the idea of herd immunity. Now, we're not wildebeest on the plane. It's not right to let the sick and the old fall behind. And if that's the kind of attitude that our government entered with, we cannot be surprised that so many have died. It just stands to reason that this is exactly what they expected, and they really don't care.
Now, a whole barrage of criticisms really came out in this report, noting quite big concerns, including access to PPE, the government's much-held track and trace system, which fundamentally was flawed. Also suggesting at the start of the pandemic, Boris Johnson said that the care homes would not be affected. Now we know in hindsight they were actually the worst affected. But the key finding really dates back to some 20 months ago, that key date of March the 23rd, when the United Kingdom entered its first lockdown. Well, this report says scientists were talking some 2 months prior to that about how ready the UK was in terms of dealing with a pandemic of this scale, and actually argues that the government acted far too slow.
It is now clear that this was the wrong policy and that it led to a higher initial death toll than would have resulted from a more emphatic early policy. In a pandemic spreading rapidly and exponentially, every week counted.
Well, Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, and his government have always maintained throughout this pandemic that policy is guided by the data and the science, and always maintains that it just simply put policy into place by the evidence that was presented to it. It also says it's sticking by its promise of allowing a public inquiry into the pandemic and the government's handling of it as well. But that won't come until at least next spring. Just to say, though, that this very report, its aim is not to point the fingers of blame. That is a quote within this report. But some already say there is only one direction of blame to point that finger, and that is squarely at the government.
I've been saying for the last couple of years with my group Names Not Numbers that the government has done an absolutely terrible job. And this is what happens when you have leaders in charge in an unmeritocratic society that don't know what they're doing. They didn't follow the science, they didn't listen to the experts, and they didn't listen to other countries that warned them. Someone like Boris Johnson is a prime example of what is wrong in British politics. And I just feel if nobody stands up to point out that this is democide, it's just something that someone has to stand up and say, because like I say, in our culture, so many people will just take it on the chin. I think that taking it on the chin is not something that this unprecedented situation deserves.